You know, when I think about the state of America right now, when I think about how so many of us are being impacted by the political decisions, I really reflect on the importance of having strong alliances across racial, ethnic, and gender lines right now. So I thank you for contributing your expertise to this conversation because if we aren't able to see past instances of alignments and alliances, then we aren't able, in my opinion, to duplicate that in the present day. So I think it would be a great starting point. Can you use your expertise, your knowledge, your skill set to kind of just give us a framework of when we are able to see the earliest instances of Black and Jewish alliances in this country and why both parties thought that it was such an important thing to engage in?
So if we go back, you realize you can actually begin to see some moments of Black-Jewish alliance even in the 19th century, coming in the period just before the Civil War. But it was not at groups, is actually at the individual level. The Cardozo family out of South Carolina is an example where there was sort of marriage of a kind in the 19th century between a free Black woman and a Jewish merchant whose son would then go on to be educated in Glasgow and Scotland and come back to then assume critical roles in the Reconstruction South as an example. But it was a conscious decision that they actually wanted to use both those relationships and the power of education to not only provide benefit for the individual, but also for the communities that they actually were coming out of. This would actually grow in depth and in expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly by the time we get to both 1908, the Niagara movement, which is, where you had a group of Black intellectuals and Black leaders come together, first on the American side, but then it was segregated, so they went over to the Canadian side, and they laid out a blueprint for social engagement and protest in the United States. Then there was the riot in Springfield, Illinois, which then gave birth to the NAACP, which brought together Black and white liberals. But among those white liberals were Jewish individuals as well, the Spingarns most notably. And so there's this way in which you went from individual attention in the mid 19th century to group activity and group organization in the early 20th century. I mean, those are some of the earliest sort of 2 points that I would sort of point to.
So we know that the Springfield race riot and how that connected with the NAACP formation at the time was a monumental moment and shift in methods of activism during that time. And for many people, that might be the most noteworthy example of this alliance taking place. Can you speak to how that happened though? Like, was this something that was created because of Black activists at the time and intellectuals reaching across the lines, or were Jewish Americans the ones that reached across, or was it just a combination?
It was a little bit of both. I would argue that Black folks have been organizing through the color conventions and other activities well through from late 19th century, well into the first decade or two of the 20th century. And so organization was not new in that sense. But coming out of the 1908 Niagara movement, there was a sense that we needed to move from individual conventions to something else that looks like a social protest movement for me in a certain kind of way. And so Springfield itself triggered, because it was the lynching of 2 Black men in Springfield, Illinois, that ruptured this sense of the American possibility. And folks came together, and there were calls that were made, as I understand it, and then communities were brought together. There were more whites than Blacks, actually, in the first days of this call. But and among those whites were also Jewish intellectuals and leaders there. But it was really talking about, and you think about Springfield, right, the home of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, and the symbolism there, that in his hometown, so to speak, that there was then this sort of ugly racial incident, and people was like, okay, we can be better than this. And so it was Black activity on the one hand, Jewish and other white activists coming together on the other hand, making this possible. And I think it took both sides, and that is energy from both sides actually made for that kind of alliance.
Yeah. So what were some of the limitations then at this time? Because oftentimes when you have a racial dynamic like this, and one group has privilege based on their skin color or the racial categorization, there can be a power dynamic there that shouldn't exist, but it's what happened, right? Can you speak a little bit more to how that may have fractured some of the leadership in NAACP?
Yeah, so it is clear that in the early days of the NAACP, um, there were room for only a handful of African Americans to really take leadership roles. Du Bois being most notable, who went on to head the crisis. But a lot of and then you had James Weldon Johnson for a while as one version of the leader, and then Walter White would follow him. But you end up realizing that a lot, both of those who control the purse strings, as well as those who were in the sort of leadership, were not black. And so that created its own tension. Du Bois, for all who have read about Du Bois and knows, W. Du Bois had a strong sense of self.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that strong sense of self was not limited to the folks in the black community. He was willing to share that with anyone he interacted
Yeah.
with. So, but he and the Spin Gardens were actually became close. Even though at times he was arguing with them over what should be addressed, how they should go about addressing it, how much attention should be paid to certain things. And all of this is part, though, I mean, I would argue, it's the part of group dynamics no matter what, right? You know, you can put people in a room, they may actually all agree on what they want to achieve, but they don't always agree on how to go about trying to achieve what that thing is. And so sometimes in the past, we want historical actors to be better than we are. And I, as a historian, have long said, people are people. They were
Exactly.
people at one point, they're people at another. They know better or worse. But if we allow them to tell us where they struggled and how they struggled and why they struggled, you also understand how they sustain the movement.
I love that. And so speaking of Du Bois and his strong sense of self and how that impacted him within our culture, we all know that the opposition of his reflections and feelings about Booker T. Washington. You know, that was well known at the time, right? But Booker T. Washington also famously aligned himself with Jewish folks and white folks in general. One of those alliances was with Julius Rosenwald. Can you speak to how his method of aligning with Jewish Americans at the time differed with Du Bois's approach? Even though they both said we need to have alliances, they both went about it in different ways. One philanthropic, the other, completely different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way in which I think both Du Bois and Washington carved out their own space, but it's almost like concentric rings. There was overlap too. I mean, so if you think about, people always talk about Du Bois believing in classical education and Washington in industrial education, and that flattens actually some of the nuances there. One, Booker T. Washington sent all his kids to get classical education, even though he understood in setting up Tuskegee the importance of really preparing young men and women for the industrial jobs that were available and growing at that time. And so Washington wrote his autobiography, Up from Slavery, which Rosenwald actually read, who had helped to create Sears and Roebuck. And he approached Washington about trying to do something for the education of the vast majority of African Americans in the rural South. Out of that came the Rosenwald schools. There were almost 5,000 of them built in rural areas. But they were built also with the understanding that black people had to have some skin in the game. And so in every instance, black communities had to raise some of the monies for the building of those schools, had to also offer their own labor for building those schools. Now, in time, I think the estimate is a third of all black individuals who were educated in the South went to a Rosenwald school. Wow. I mean, so think of the impact that they had, particularly in rural areas where the education of African Americans was not a top state priority. In fact, the dollars were, it's incredible, the disparity between what dollar allowances for black students in each state in the South as compared for white students, let alone the fact that black school teachers only earn a fraction of what white school teachers earned for doing the same job. And so all of these disparities were there. Whereas you go back to Du Bois aligned himself not with trying to build those kinds of institutions, but doing two other things. Is one is using his repertoire of skills to actually critique and analyze American society in all of its forms. In the books he wrote, the articles he wrote, the stories that he put out. And then two, trying to help create then institutions like the NAACP, which will have chapters in major cities around the country, understanding that one way to attend to the civil rights needs of African Americans is to make sure you had someone who was going to actually be there on the ground in these communities nationwide.
Right. And I think, like you said, I think that's something that we often get misunderstood because it takes both strategies to be successful. Something that's very interesting that you mentioned is that I'm thinking of is this investment in schools, but then there's this direct line between that and then the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So can you speak a little bit more about that? Because were these schools kept well over time? Because why would we then be fighting for integration if we already had top quality schools, right? Is the assumption. And can you speak to how Jewish folks also advocated for that decision as well?
Yeah, so if you go back and they ask you answer your first part of the question, and so they're thinking about the schools were necessary because the alternative in many locations was nothing. Now, were they always the very best that was available? No. Not all of them actually had the latest chemistry lab or the latest other tools and things there. But if the option is nothing, yeah, they were critical. But Thurgood Marshall, Jack Green, and others who were actually engaged in activities related to desegregating schools across the country also came to understand that you couldn't carve out one little part and not deal with the whole thing. The real question was separate but equal. And you started dealing with that in the school setting, but that had ramifications for every other setting of American life. And so they were trying to figure out how to then say, okay, we benefited from the Rosenwald schools. There's a whole illustrious alumni of the Rosenwald schools, but that's not enough. As we enter into the period, particularly post-World War II, 45 into 54, you realize that those schools then were for one period in American history. We're moving into another period of American history. The atomic bomb had been dropped. We were in the nuclear age now. And so we had to figure out how to actually identify other kinds of resources. Jewish individuals worked at many different levels in that effort, from their work with the NAACP, also in connection with the Urban League and other organizations like that, to provide some assistance, material and intellectual, as well as just being there and being counted. So that was one part. But the second part is that particularly going to the course, is also to say on the ground in communities around the country, segregation was wrong. So if you think about it, for Jewish Americans who had endured a quota system, particularly in higher education in the United States, there was this sense of what it meant to be excluded. And so there, it was palpable in coming out of the events of World War II and the Holocaust in Germany, that realizing that exclusion could be deadly. And so people began to stitch these things together, both at the individual level, but also at the group and societal level. The net result is that by the time we get to the Brown decision, we're at a point where people say, okay, this is not only unconstitutional, it's wrong.
Wow. When you say exclusion can be deadly, that's profound.
Yeah.
Because I think about where we are now as a nation and how so much of what divides us is based on just the remnants of that segregation.
Yeah.
Because even with that decision, we are still living segregated lives, but we come together oftentimes with our cell phones and argue with each other without ever truly knowing who each other is. Something else you mentioned too, in regards to Rosenwald reading Booker T. Washington's book is profound too, because now let's think about that today. Like that that book might be banned in certain schools, and him not knowing Booker T directly but reading his book had a profound impact on him. So I want you to imagine for a second that you have a classroom of young black folks, young Jewish folks, and you only get a chance to lecture to them one time, okay? You're not gonna see them over the course of the semester. What is one of the most important historical lessons you would teach them, like a little known fact about this alliance that they would need to know moving forward?
I would take them back a million or so years, and I would go back and say, he realized that we've unraveled the human genome. And now we can say with great precision that humankind as we know it originated on the African continent. And that in fact, all humans share 99.9% of the same DNA. So that in effect, all of human history has been written about 1/10 of 1% of difference. So they sit with that for a moment. All of human history has been written about 1/10 of 1% of difference. And so we created a whole series of stories about how we're different. So what if we start from the other end and start by saying, in most instances, 99.9% gets rounded up to 100%. And so we all share the same human story. How do we begin to connect those human stories? And so I would start my students there, actually thinking and say, you think you're in a history course, but I'm going to start you with science and DNA because it connects to history. So now begin to plot out those moments of cross-purpose alliances. Can you begin to do it in the 19th century, the early 20th century, the mid-20th century, the late 20th century? Can you find moments also where you came apart and all? I said, but as you map that out and we can do a timeline, and then you come back and say, but then put 99.9% down below. And sort of juxtapose the 99.9% with those moments of continuity and discontinuity and ask, can we get to a period where 99.9% gets rounded up to 100 and we get to a period of continuity?
I think you would hear a pin drop in that class, and I think we would have solved the problems that we had. Because I know that, but just even hear you articulate it in that way it's motivated me. Thank you for those profound lessons and for that profound statement and declaration. It's great talking to you.
I loved it. Thank you.
Thank you.